everyone. This is Ricky Stevens. Welcome back to AGRITECTURE's digital conference series. Today we have Francis Baumont de Oliveira, who is a PhD researcher at University of Liverpool. And Francis is going to take us through addressing risk in vertical farming. So Francis, with that, I'll kick it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Ricky. And thank you again for the opportunity to let me present a little bit about my research in the AGRITECTURE Travel-Free Digital Conference. So I've spent the last few years kind of immersing myself in the world of vertical farming, understanding the risks and challenges involved, and how I can best address them in the short space of time that I have during my PhD. So the promise of vertical farming is initially what kind of drew me in. I thought it was a really exciting tool to engage with social, food, and environmental issues. I actually did my master's degree in aerospace engineering, but really the draw of sustainability and tackling so many engineering issues in vertical farming was really quite unprecedented for me. And vertical farming seemed like a way to try and inspire behavior change in youth. So I thought that was really, quite a strong pull for me. In Liverpool, we actually do a kind of future food challenge for kind of 13-year-olds to help inspire them in developing their own kind of eco startup and business. And because one of the biggest challenges is this kind of aging farming population. I know in America it's around kind of 58 or 60, the average age of a farmer.
Yeah, close to 60 now.
It's a similar issue in the UK, and I think it's just such an important issue to try and address. And high-tech urban ag is really exciting for them, and also helps them engage with healthy eating. So this industry has been expanding really rapidly with increasingly large investments, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, such as Plenty or Aero Farms, Bowery. And yet people report these kind of issues of kind of funding, scaling, and labor. A lot of these companies are kind of pre-revenue stage. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and kind of my kind of primary driver is always curiosity, and I want to know exactly kind of what happened on these farms that failed, and understand the key failure modes. So I know in the CA census, they kind of said labor, funding, and scaling were important. I want to understand why exactly those issues occur. So I've interviewed around a dozen vertical farms across the UK, some abroad, in my pilot kind of interviews. So I've spoken to people at kind of Plantagen, kind of read the literature on what happened at Local Garden and Farmed Here, and a lot of these challenges that occurred around labour management, process flow, where farms weren't designed with kind of humans in mind to be running these systems, and running into kind of bottleneck issues, or having really highly automated systems that end up being really, really expensive to repair when they stop working. I know in Plantagen, for example, they had massive cash flow issues. They had a massive patent portfolio. And when they ran into zoning code issues and planning permission, then they couldn't really sustain the income to be able to pay their patents. A lot of these farms actually had trouble with a kind of lack of focus. I always like to try and incorporate the Pareto 80-20 rule into how I do things. And I think that farms should really hone in on either food or R&D. And if they're going in R&D, I'm seeing a lot of duplicative efforts into designing very, very similar solutions rather than collaborating together and understanding how they can kind of build upon each other's solutions. So those for me are some of the key reasons why some of the farms have failed. We had one in Liverpool as well, Grow Liverpool, which are doing edible flowers. And they found it really hard to train new farmers when they don't have an experienced workforce. If you don't have the automation for, say, nutrients, for example, then trying to train new staff to do that and not mess it up ends up being quite challenging. So I identified some of the kind of key risks as well that farms that are still operating have faced, and understanding what affects their profitability and their profit margins. And it comes to things, say, like floods, kind of having plant pathogen and pest outbreaks. Some farms can't run at full capacity and then have to drop it down to, say, 30% because they run into a bottleneck in their process flow. Maybe their packaging machine isn't able to sustain full capacity. And until they upgrade that machine, they've forked out on this massive farm that actually they can't run. So those are some interesting considerations when kind of predicting the profitability of a farm. Now, there's also market risk. So sometimes you're selling to a supermarket and they'll actually decide last minute that they don't want your order and just offload all the risk onto you. Or kind of market shocks where, for example, we have this coronavirus, this unprecedented situation where the restaurant market has been slashed in like a month, and that's your whole customer base gone. That's inevitably going to affect your profits. Or say in a supermarket, your competitors actually slash their prices in half to make sure that people buy their premium product over yours on a kind of discount deal. I've noticed in some situations that's happened. So I'm really fascinated by these failure modes, and I've tried to characterize them into my modeling so that when a farm is planning their business, they can account for a lot of these risks and uncertainties happening. Like I said, the kind of funders, the investors looking to go into the space, I rarely see, I mean, I haven't seen everyone's pitch deck, obviously, but I imagine that a lot of these farms don't present the fact that they're addressing these risks when they pitch their business plan. So the model that I've been working on is predicting return on investment and profitability with a level of randomness involved. So say that you can see my cursor here, say your profit or your ROI is at a given point in time, that the next step in time, say maybe a year on, it's not going to be a fixed number. The world is increasingly uncertain and anything could happen in a year's time. So it's more likely to say that there's a probability that actually you might lose some money that year. There's also a probability that you'll earn more. And if it ducks under a certain point, say you're not meeting your required ROI for your investors, and that's the level of risk involved that you can communicate to them. So on the right here, I think you can see, if I move my face to the other side, these simulations as a kind of proof of concept of potential vertical farming scenario. So say this is a given farm and you start off with a minus 100,000 of net profit because you're initially losing money. And then every time you run, actually, most of them tend to be going up. Over the course of 5 years, you start to kind of break even and start earning more money. Now, this isn't kind of accurate numbers, but just as a proof, you can see some farmers might initially just end up kind of just working up the whole time. Some actually end up crashing and falling and burning. Maybe they were doing quite well for the first 10 years and then, I don't know, they have an equipment failure or they lose a massive contract and they end up kind of losing a lot of their money. Some of them just crash and burn after 5 years. Some of them actually gain a lot more money. Maybe they just got a new contract or they introduce a new technology that increases their profit substantially. So incorporating this level of risk and uncertainty allows for companies to kind of predict the probability of them going bankrupt and assure their investors that actually they've accounted for all these risks and done their best to mitigate them. And I think I haven't seen any uncertainty addressed in the literature of this quite new emerging space. So in the next picture, the kind of method that I use is this thing called probability bounds analysis, called P boxes, where you actually account for all the kind of tangle of different scenarios and collect them together to say your future lies within this space. So this is the kind of probability of you going bankrupt, and your future scenario is this kind of gray box where it could be. Now, if you're more certain about your business plan and you know exactly what you're going to price it, for example, you've done your best to mitigate a lot of the unknown risks, then actually maybe it will become smaller and be more within the safe area. And communicating all the things you've done to your investor is much likely for them to think, okay, they've accounted for all the lessons learned in previous projects, which they're slightly or understandably averse to investing in a new project when so many have failed before them. And I think that's quite a promising way to engage with them and increase the likelihood of getting an investment. So I've been encompassing this model that I've been building and set out a big vision for this kind of software, this collaborative software for developing your business plan, which is quite similar to agritecture recently, agritecture designer, sorry. I was actually kind of working on this before it came out in the beta, before the beta designer, and published a paper on it, and sets out a vision of basically someone plans out their farm, what kind of integration type, what kind of farm characteristics, what kind of appliances they have. So what level of HVAC control, or do they have a lift, for example? And then they plan out their different crop types. And you could plan out the uncertainty in those values. So for example, you could have optimistic projections or pessimistic projections, or maybe the average of what you think could be kind of in between. And encouraging best practices. So you could look at your kind of energy performance and see what your overall score was for energy, and how you could drive improvements to reduce your OPEX. So in some vertical farms in Japan, they actually managed to double their cost performance. So cut their OPEX in half and improve their revenue by 50%. So these sort of ways of encouraging you to improve your farm or your business plan is kind of provided in this sort of setup. And then the uncertainty will be incorporated by double clicking any parameter, and allowing the user to basically express the uncertainty about a particular value that they're unsure about, whether that's the price of a crop or the kind of energy costs associated with HVAC. Or maybe it's a risk that they actually want to insert themselves that we haven't accounted for. So you could say that a value was exactly between, maybe it's at most a certain value, give its level of units, the nature of the units, whether it's kind of something they've witnessed, or whether it was given to them, for example, the yield projection was given to them by the supplier of their system. And they can justify, give the reason as to how they came to that value, give a reference to it if they know it. And that would allow for them to then project that uncertainty in the graphs that I showed earlier. And the last thing is trying to collect all the different kind of equipment solutions that are out there. At the moment, I think as a business, there's so many different solutions out there, and you're not really sure what works, what doesn't work, what the kind of specifications are, what the kind of yield projections are. And I think it causes a bit of decision fatigue for a lot of kind of entrepreneurs when it's almost quite overwhelming, this new space, when the technology still hasn't been validated yet and there's no standards. So having something that actually collects all the solutions and allows you to do the kind of economic trade-offs, for example, between LED lights and HPS lamps, and having the kind of efficiency rate of these lights, I think would be a really valuable asset in kind of developing a business plan. And the last thing, so coming back to risk quantification, there's also risk management. And I think a lot of these farms don't actually go through the process of developing a risk register. And I think encouraging farms to do that would be really invaluable. So basically considering all the worst case scenarios, all the things that could go wrong in your farm. And one of my favorite quotes from Seneca, Stoic, is, "We suffer more in imagination than we do in reality." So actually just being able to plan through these worst case scenarios and how you would react kind of avoids you doing a knee-jerk reaction when something goes wrong when you're starting up your farm. And I think having that, showing that to investors and such as well, will increase your likelihood of having a successful project. So I think that's everything from me anyway. Thanks for listening, and do you have any questions? I think you're muted, Ricky.
Thanks, Francis. Can you maybe stop sharing your screen and we can move into Q&A?
That worked? Great.
Yes. All right. Great presentation. Very concise. I know there's a lot more you can share, but we can get to some of that in the Q&A. So I first want to just start with, I think that was a great breakdown of just understanding why risk assessment is helpful. You said that you came from the aerospace world before this, or at least for your master's degree. I'm curious, whether in the aerospace industry or other industries, where do you see that there's like just a more of a reliance on risk assessment models?
Right. So, I mean, to be honest, the Risk Institute that I'm based at, and risk research is a relatively niche sort of area. And in a lot of disciplines and fields, they haven't really considered it. In engineering, for example, we tend to use confidence intervals, but we actually can't compute with these kind of variables. So the Risk Institute actually deals with a lot of kind of simulation-based modeling for worst case projections, the uncertainty around kind of medical testing, for example. In this coronavirus situation, there's a lot of, for example, we're not really sure how correct the tests are that are being given out. What's the kind of false positives, false negatives, and a lot of one analogy that my supervisor, not an analogy, one thing that my supervisor worked on as well was the fact that in satellites going passing by overhead, actually they reduce the error bounds of their projections, even though they're not necessarily accurate, because that way in their simulations the satellites don't crash into each other. So it's kind of equivalent to us burying our heads in the sand and hoping that they don't crash into each other, but actually there's a lot more uncertainty that we need to account for. So places like NASA are really interested in it, and kind of those are a few examples. Anyway, I could go off on a tangent about more.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And then I'm just curious, what has been some of the most challenging aspects to your research? Is it like coming across the data? Is it modeling the data? Is it actually like the software side of coding this out? And what's been some of the most challenging aspects?
I think, yeah, so you've kind of encompassed quite a few issues that I've run into there. I wasn't a software developer to begin with, but it's kind of, firstly, doing the interviews and data collection, because it's kind of pre-competitive space, and people are quite kind of cautious to share their knowledge because they're worried that people will get an unfair advantage and they'll miss out. Getting data around the kind of economics and profitability margins, even the kind of the yield of their crops and how they've been affected. A lot of these companies sometimes aren't even collecting any data at all. That's been particularly challenging. So I've had to make a lot of assumptions around things that I'm not sure whether they're correct, and I've kind of had to model things to be filled in at a later date. That's one of the key challenges. Then setting out the whole software platform of what the thing could do. I've only showed a few slides of what it could do. It was quite a conceptual paper that I wrote, and actually modeling that all and having all the software up and running would actually take a team behind me. And I've been working kind of single-handedly on it. So I've learned to focus in on just the economics and the risk assessment side of things.
Got it. And then, you mentioned the difference between, or you mentioned when you were talking about some of the failures in the industry, that some of these groups need to consider whether they really want to be actually selling food as a business, or whether they really exist to be doing R&D. I've seen other folks in the industry, kind of talk about how there's this division that's starting to happen where you have, some companies that have tried to build their own tech and also sell food, also be a consumer facing brand, have to really draw a line in the sand. Is that kind of the future that you imagine, is that you're going to have true operators that are using others' technology? You're going to have actual technology providers, and then you're going to have like actual R&D institutes that are being a little bit more open and transparent about the R&D that they're putting out there, that can kind of talk back to or that the technology companies and the operators can really pull from.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's kind of a combination of both. I think both the R&D and the operators would have to work together to kind of test the solutions and such. But I think by dispersing between R&D and growing, you're diffusing a lot of your attention, and the potential for you to become a profitable farm. I think by doing so, and I think because farms aren't necessarily, some have been profitable, but many have struggled to reach that level of profitability. They kind of shy away from trying to improve the farm per se, and end up focusing on R&D as another source of revenue to compensate, which I think is relatively natural. But I think just with any business, you should focus on one particular thing. And in Farm Urban, for example, the local enterprise that I've been collaborating with my PhD, they were focusing a lot of their attention on education and outreach, and splitting that 50-50 with the farm operations. And they've had to learn to focus more on the farm as they've kind of installed this new farm and getting it up and running, because realizing actually it's a mix of both that we want, but the primary driver is to have this farm that we could actually run to full capacity. Yeah, so I guess kind of the short answer to your question is, I do think that's the future. I just think it requires collaboration on both ends. And these research kind of R&D industry collectives, such as say UK UAT or the Japanese Plant Factory Association, are kind of the middlemen in bridging the gap between these research institutes, universities, and farms. And by synergizing together, I think that reduces a lot of the risk, rather than relying upon these farms to develop everything from scratch. That potentially would result in something that isn't really better than the other solutions out there.
Yep. There's also a Farm Tech Society in Europe, but I want to give them
right, exactly.
a shout out. So tell me, I'm curious, you've been doing this research for a while now. What is your overall assessment of where the industry is at versus your expectations coming in? Are you more or less optimistic, I guess, about a farm that's starting out in the vertical farming world today, as to whether or not they could become a profitable business, right? Because you still hear a lot of, well, technology is improving, and so yes, there's been some failures, but technology is getting better. Are we there already? Do you think that there's, I have my own answer obviously, but do you think that a business, if they make the right decisions and they make sure that they have a plan B or a plan C to solve for some of these risk factors, can be profitable? Do you feel more confident in that, or less confident versus when you started out?
I'm really curious to hear your side of things as well, actually, so you can tell me afterwards. But I think in some cases the technology is there. I think the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to do a sensitivity analysis to understand exactly what the most important variables are that drive forward the profitability of a farm. What I've identified so far is kind of the electricity pricing and the price that you sell it for. And as the technology becomes to become more and more mature, and we drive the product quality up and improve that, I think you can demand a much higher price for a market that's still growing, and then you're almost creating a new market that people have never had crop this fresh and this good, and people still haven't completely realized that yet. And then there's not the market available to make it profitable. But as more and more farms start and the equipment starts to become cheaper, I presume that the capex will become less, the efficiency will improve, and they will become more and more profitable. I think one of the researchers in Princeton said around 85% of farms fail after several years without further capital investment. But I think that number's going down more and more. And I mean, I think the farms in Japan are kind of a testament to some scenarios where they have been profitable. Like I said, reducing their OPEX by 50%, improving their revenue by 50%, doubling their cost performance. And it's just a matter of ironing out the kinks and try and error. And I think they started a little bit ahead of us, and they're collaborating more. And I think we'll start to see more people collaborating. Like I said, the kind of farm tech and UK UAT, people are sharing more lessons learned, kind of troubleshooting things together. And I think Henry Ford, as you said, is it Henry Ford? You might want to cut this out. But I think there's a famous quote that basically you can go faster alone, or you go further together. And I think if we work together, we're much more likely to reach profitability a lot sooner for a lot of the farms in the Western countries.
And maybe one more specific follow-up on that is, do you feel like, and you might not maybe have had enough data points on this from your interviews and everything, but do you think that there's enough learnings to be had from an operational standpoint right now? So say if you couldn't make technology improvements, if a farm, went out and they purchased the right technology for, how they were trying to grow for the crops that they'd
Right.
selected, and their space and everything. Is it a matter of just really learning what works and making operational improvements? Or are you saying that, no, you also need to incorporate new technology as well, as it comes out and becomes more efficient?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure because, like I said, no one's sharing data, and the lack of baseline data and standardization makes it really hard for me to kind of scientifically say something for sure.
Yeah.
I think one of the main things is I would like to see is farms collecting data around their energy use per kilogram of crop that they collect, collecting the kind of water use per kilogram, the amount of hours required in terms of man hours, to run their farms and their operations, kind of the amount of waste they're producing, these kind of sustainer metrics, to be able to compare different farms and how they kind of are performing. And from that, we can start to see the differences of the profitable farms and the farms that are kind of before profit. I think in Japan, what they're doing, some of the big farms, they're seeing some of the smaller farms start to fail, and they're actually going out and either buying their farms or supporting them a little bit to try and help them reach that profitable stage. And what those best practices are is kind of what I'm trying to collect through these interviews and observations that I'm doing. But I don't want to give away anything too prematurely.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you'd published a paper, was it last year, detailing some of your research?
So it's not published, it's in press, but it's due later this year.
Okay.
It's a collaborative decision support system for vertical farming business developments, which laid out the kind of some of the mock-ups that I showed you, kind of the key failure modes, and kind of encompasses all the research that I've done to date. And the second paper that I've done, that is going to be published in a conference next month or in July even, is about addressing lean principles. So I'm kind of taking a two-pronged approach. One end, planning your business and trying to increase your profitability margins, and the other thing, looking at addressing some of the labor issues and improving process flow and reducing some guidelines to help farms be more efficient in their operations.
And how can people follow you for updates on when those papers are published?
You can either follow me on Twitter at Francis Baumont, or I have a ResearchGate profile as well, which I'm sure we can put in the link, the YouTube video or something.
Yep. Yeah, we can drop that in there.
Great.
Okay, great. I just wanted to mention a couple other things that you had brought up. So one was the CEA census. For those that aren't aware, we can add a link up here. The CEA census is a global census that AGRITECTURE conducted alongside AutoGrow. We surveyed over 350 controlled environment growers around the world and published those results last year in 2019. And that's available on our website at agritexture.com for free download. So really great report, just covering, sort of overall high level, trying to understand some patterns in the industry and some general data points. So great resource. Let's see what else I had down here.
I kind of take for granted that maybe your readers have read that already, but yeah, it's definitely worth a read. That I think out of everything I've seen in the industry, that kind of provides the best overview of what's going on in the vertical farming and CA sector.
Yeah, thank you. And then, of course, you mentioned AGRITECTURE Designer. There's some obvious overlap here in terms of your work and some of the things we've laid out with AGRITECTURE Designer. I think that maybe one difference is with AGRITECTURE Designer, we've really tried to take a little bit more of a user forward approach. So while we've, on the back end, some of the data modeling is quite complex, we've tried to make it as simple as possible for our users to be able to come up with like a simple financial feasibility model we also have some educational videos in there as well. So some of what you mentioned, actually, I found really parallel to some of the points that Henry, who teaches one of the 6 lessons in there, touches on about really trying to focus in on, what is your core purpose as a business and how are you going to earn revenue?
Totally.
So, but yeah, I think, some of the things that you have in there are around just planning for risk in all sorts of different ways and being able to layer that in there and change the slope of your kind of risk assessment curve. I think are really interesting, and things that we don't necessarily have as part of our feasibility analysis today. Things that we're definitely thinking about, but I see a future where if you were to build this out more, there definitely would be opportunities to kind of layer one on top of another and not necessarily have them overlap too much. So I think it's really exciting, everything
Thanks
that
so
you're
much.
looking into. And I think, ultimately for us at AGRITECTURE, we really care about driving the industry forward. We also want there to be fewer failures in the industry. And we really do believe that with proper planning, you can set up you can create a profitable business model. And ultimately it really comes down to assessing some of those risks, making sure you avoid past mistakes, and really understanding your local market, right? What is going to work over there in Liverpool for you is not necessarily going to work for us in New York, or isn't going to work in Mexico City or Toronto or all these other places around the world where we're seeing a lot of interest and growth in local agriculture. So that's my take.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for the opportunity. And I think, just to echo everything that you said, I think just sharing and collaborating and helping the industry drive forward all the kind of lessons learned is really crucial to see the industry succeed.
Great. Thanks so much, Francis. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Cheers, Ricky.
All right.